Good evening, you're all welcome. I'm just going to introduce the panel. I'm going to ask some questions and I will throw it open as soon as I possibly can to you, the audience, to take part. We all live now in a new media world where participation is the key to everything. I just want to say, before I introduce the panel, that we are not here really to rehearse your views on the Middle East conflict. Because I think that I'm sure many of you have, as perhaps all of us do, views about that, but that's not the purpose of this discussion. The purpose of this discussion is really to explore how the media covered it, whether they covered it adequately, and the arrangements that the Israeli government made to prevent journalists going into Gaza, and why they did that, and so on. So it's not a case really of saying I support the Palestinian people, I love Israel or whatever, and then go back. There's no agreement over context, no agreement over history, and we'll be here forever and a day if we go through that particular conflict. So I'm trying to make that an early warning sign before we start. On my left is Harriet Sherwood, who's the head of international news at The Guardian. What used to be called in the language of newspapers the foreign editor. She's neither foreign, but she is an editor. On her left is Lior Ben-Dor, who is from the Israeli embassy and a spokesman on matters of the media from the Israeli embassy here in London. Next to him is Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera's man on the border during the conflict in Gaza. Al Jazeera was unique in having 4 correspondents inside Gaza, 2 from Al Jazeera English and 2 from Al Jazeera Arabic, but they corresponded, and so they were covering the war, the only news organization that covered the war, let's call it a war, for the sake of argument. They covered it on both sides. On his left is Jonathan Miller, who is from Channel 4, a foreign affairs correspondent who was also covering this conflict. And then up on the screen we have Ruthie Bloom-Leibovitz from the Jerusalem Post, who's here via Skype and looking lovely. That's the only possible sexist statement made. I'm going to start by asking Lior, if I might, because it's the real start of the discussion about access. Access to journalists was denied, and many of us found that unique in some respects, although of course the British did it during the Falklands War very successfully, but they did at least allow some correspondence in. But you denied all journalists the chance to go into Gaza. I'd like you to explain first of all why you think the Israeli government did that.
Well, you know, it's a tough job to represent a state while the others here are representing media outlets, and of course a state in war. I understand your need and your desire to cover the events from the area. I understand why you really were upset when Israel denied you this possibility to enter into Gaza and to cover the war as professionally as you could. But me, as a representative of a state, I also expect you to understand my view as a sovereign state who had to wage a war against its enemies, and you have to understand that it was our sovereign decision for our security reasons to avoid letting journalists in Gaza. Let me give you an example. You know that it is, you can imagine that it is very difficult for any soldier to focus on its target when he has to take care at the same time for the life and safety of a foreign journalist who is not his enemy. Let's imagine a situation where a journalist from The Guardian or from Channel 4 are situated in a first floor of a building in Gaza, just doing their job. But it happens that in the same building or in the second floor there is a Hamas gunmen shooting at on our forces. It's very difficult to expect our forces to wait until the journalists will evacuate the building until we respond fire. So I just urge you to, I'm just asking you to understand the complexity of allowing journalists to be there around in such a complicated, densely populated area.
Well, so the line always was that you did it for our safety. You know, you did it for journalist safety. Was that the only reason? I mean, are you saying that journalists could not make that decision for themselves as to whether they risk their lives? And you don't have any agenda, as it were, about preventing journalists from doing their job, which is to observe, be eyewitnesses to events and so on?
No, we don't. Even when we assume this is right, that this war, any war, is not photogenic, and that any war, and of course this war, produced horrible pictures which were a damage to Israeli public relations. This was not the reason. And by the way, let me remind you that Gaza is not surrounded by Israel from all over. The border between Gaza and Egypt is not controlled by any way whatsoever but by Israel. I assume that the journalist also applied for the same time to the Egyptian authorities to get into Gaza. I don't know if they applied. I don't know what was the reply that they received from the Egyptians.
Okay, well, you're nodding away there, Harriet. Let me ask you, firstly, were you happy with that view? Two questions, really. Firstly, were you happy with the view that the Israelis were trying to protect your journalist from being fired on? And secondly, answer the question about whether or not you applied to go through Egypt.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that the security of our journalists is of absolute paramount importance to us. And it's something that you know, people, desk editors such as myself, think about all the time, as well as obviously the people out in the field. But you know, I would say that is our responsibility, and I absolutely don't buy what Lior says about the primary reason why Israel refused to allow access to Gaza during this conflict was in order to protect the security of foreign journalists. I mean, I think it's much more akin to their desire not to allow this conflict to be reported freely and openly. In the Lebanon war of 2.5 years ago, journalists did have free access. I don't recall any journalists being killed or injured in that conflict, so I don't quite know why you've changed your mind, except for the reporting of that conflict was, on the whole, quite unfavourable to Israel, and I think that Israel then decided that it wasn't going to repeat that experience and was going to ban journalists. And in fact, you know, we know that the Israeli government set up a unit about 8 months ago to actually think about media coverage and the sort of PR around this coming conflict in Gaza. So, you know, I don't buy your answer, and I would say that yes, of course, journalist safety is important, but that's our responsibility. And, you know, obviously we would consider all those things very carefully. In terms of
Egypt.
Applying to Egypt, I mean, eventually that's how all our news organisations did get in, apart from the journalists who went in embedded with the Israeli military, which The Guardian wasn't one of those. But you know, we did get through eventually through Egypt, and yes, of course, we made efforts to get in through other means. But I mean, actually, when you say Israel doesn't control all access to Gaza, I mean, it does pretty much. I mean, there's one entrance, one crossing from Egyptian territory, and you know, actually, they did let journalists through.
I'm going to go, before you answer that, I'm going to go to Ruthie, but before I do, just to clear up one point, you didn't allow in foreign journalists, but did you allow in Israeli journalists?
No.
No journalists at all. Ruthie, did
Israeli journalists aren't allowed to report from Gaza at all.
Of course, that's the case. Thank you. Ruthie, did you as a journalist in Israel feel that the Israeli government were right to stop you and anyone else from entering Gaza?
Yes, I did, as a matter of fact. And as it happens, we Israeli journalists haven't been allowed inside Gaza since Hamas took over. So one might say that there is a level of envy involved in the fact that foreign journalists have been allowed. But as to your question, as to whether I supported the government's decision not to let journalists in, I did, and I really did think, not for censorship reasons, and I'll get into that in a moment. It really was so dangerous. In fact, the Israeli army was so busy trying to avoid killing civilians. I think it would have just been that much harder for them to also have to worry about journalists. As to the issue of censorship, the reason that I think it has nothing whatsoever to do with that is that, in fact, we were seeing footage from Gaza, Al Jazeera, from Ramadan. We had photos on TV. They were all over the world. It's not as though there was no coverage. In fact, some of my colleagues in Israel were against the ban because what they said was, look, the only coverage we're getting is from Al Jazeera. Wouldn't it be better to have a Western media outlet in there? My feeling is that the coverage would have been much different. Western outlets either, as is in evidence since the war has ended, or the operation temporarily ended, let me say.
Okay, let me go to Al Jazeera's man here who was on the border. I mean, you've heard what Leo has to say. You've heard Ruthie back that up in a sense, being quite happy about the situation. How did you read it?
I thought there was a deliberate decision taken, as has been said, after the Lebanon war, that was a political embarrassment for the Israeli government, and it was a PR embarrassment for the Israeli government. Therefore, the decision was taken at that point that wasn't going to happen again. Part of the reason that Lebanon was viewed as a disaster, not to say it was a disaster, but it was viewed as a disaster, was because Israel lost the PR battle, undoubtedly lost the PR battle. And I think by blocking journalists, you gave an extra cudgel to your opponents to beat you with. You can't turn around and say, we are the best democracy in the Middle East, that we are the greatest democracy, better than all these countries that are led by tyrants and dictators, and then ban one of the basic elements of democracy, which is freedom of speech, which is exactly what you did. And I think that was bad. That was appalling. And also, I think not only did you do a disservice to the media, I think the Israeli government did a great disservice to its people, because part of the reason the media is there is to work to show people what is going on in their name. And by banning the media, the international media, Al Jazeera were there and covered it extensively. I think you did a great disservice to the people of Israel who couldn't see what was going on.
I'm going to give you a chance, Leo, to come back to that, but Jonathan, let me go to you.
Well, I covered the war in Lebanon in 2006, and just to repeat what's already been said, we took our own risk assessments and we're fine. We were able to cover that with unimpeded access, albeit difficult access to Hezbollah, as would have probably been the case with Hamas. We got in via Rafah on the Egyptian side. On the day that the ceasefire was declared, that was when the Egyptians finally did open the border to a lot of journalists who'd been waiting there. I feel that, well, I actually agree with Alan here that a disservice was done to the media and to the people of Israel in preventing journalists getting in. Were Israel's military objectives better met through doing so? Yes, probably, because one of the words that's been connected or associated repeatedly with this conflict has been disproportionate. Now, what it meant, having a lot of journalists on the border with Gaza but stuck inside Israel, meant that, of course, they wanted reporter involvement. So what did they cover? They covered the Israeli side. So you saw Western reporters wearing flak jackets, running around after Israeli ministers to places in Sderot and Ashkelon and nearby cities, which were indeed being hit by the Qassam rockets coming across. Good footage was coming out from Palestinian journalists inside. I've heard the view expressed quite forcefully that Israel did shoot itself in the foot in some respects, because had Western journalists been allowed in there to report objectively on the situation as the war was unfolding, they might have got footage of Hamas militants with their legs blown off or whatever in the hospitals, talk to them, that sort of thing. But did we see that? No, we didn't. There was nothing of the sort. All we actually saw from inside Gaza were absolutely appalling scenes of dead babies and women and children in hospitals and this sort of thing. I think it was very difficult to cover this war in any objective way, and those who did get in afterwards, after the ceasefire, were truly shocked, as I was, by what they did find.
You seem to indicate, therefore, that the Israelis lost the media battle in spite of having banned the journalists. Is that your view?
Look, I went in as an eyewitness to Gaza, and I reported what I saw. It is not my job to frame an opinion as such as to whether or not Israel won or lost. All I can say is that my sense was that it was difficult, more difficult, for Palestinian journalists to impartially cover that conflict than it would have been for Western journalists to have done so. Would it have been better had Jeremy Bowen, had Lindsay Hilson, my colleague from Channel 4, had other journalists got in and like Al Jazeera, actually reported from the ground in Gaza? Would there have been sort of a more emotive response in the British public? Would it have led to the war being stopped sooner? Possibly, but it's an unknown unknown. We just really can't speculate about that. That's about it, really.
Can I just make one point?
Yeah.
Sorry, I totally understand why the Israelis did it. And if I was in their position, I would probably have done the same or tried to do the same. But can I just say, when the Israelis say we were doing it to protect journalists, that flies in the face of the evidence of what the Israelis have been doing over the last 18 months. From the James Miller case to the Reuters cameraman who was targeted when it was absolutely clear he was just filming and was in an area designated for the press, when the Israelis again during the war in Gaza attacked the media building, knowing the coordinates, knowing that it was media that was there, and attacked Ramatan and other organizations, media organizations inside there. On one hand, for the Israelis to say we were protecting the media, we were making sure that you were safe, against your track record, it doesn't quite match, I'm afraid.
Leon, you've plenty of questions to come back to.
Yes, I waited for my turn to respond to what you said in the beginning. I think that you didn't accurately interpret what I said, about the safety. It's not necessarily that we care for the safety of the journalists, okay? Just a moment.
Yeah.
When I describe the situation, okay, where there are Hamas gunmen in the same area with the journalist, I spoke about the safety of our soldiers, okay? Because I said that you wouldn't expect our soldiers to wait until the journalist will evacuate the area until they respond. So the soldiers, our forces, has to respond immediately on any fire shot at them. And the presence of journalists near them complicates the issue, okay? Of course, the result of it, of course, the byproduct of it will be also a better security and safety for the journalists because they will not enter there. Now, about the comparison with Lebanon.
Yes.
Lebanon is another case because even if we don't let journalists go through Israel into Lebanon, Lebanon is a sovereign country, and any journalist can take a flight to Beirut airport, and from Beirut to take a car and reach southern Lebanon. So it was not for us to decide whether journalists will go to Lebanon or not.
Before the runways were bombed.
It was our decision to decide whether those journalists will go into Lebanon through our territory. And this was exactly our decision this time. I think it's our right, whether you like it or not, and I understand your frustration, to decide whether journalists will go into Gaza through our territory.
But if they tried to go through international waters, the Israeli Navy threatened to blow them out the water.
Right. The issue of the maritime territory of Gaza, of course, Israel has to, well, now we enter into some political issues, but it's unavoidable. You know, well, I assume that you know that Israel has to control the maritime territory in front of the shores of Gaza, because we know that if we don't do that, the rulers of Gaza, Hamas organization of Gaza, will take advantage of it and will smuggle through the sea some weapons and explosive, which they have been able to do only through the tunnels right now.
Which is fair enough, and I accept that argument, but you can't say Gaza is a sovereign territory, but not really.
One day in the future, maybe Gaza will belong to the future Palestinian state, which will live side by side peacefully with the state of Israel.
Let me just take up this issue that's been raised really by all three speakers here, which is that this was an act of censorship rather than anything else. But firstly, do you think it was censorship to prevent journalists from doing their work?
The result was censorship, but it was not the intention.
But do you, and this was suggested by Jonathan, do you think, looking back now at the way the conflict was covered in the West, the pictures, nightly pictures, and the way it was covered, do you think you did, to use Jonathan's phrase, shoot yourself in the foot?
It's the question here whether we think, in our view, that we lost the PR war or something else. I think before me trying to judge it, I think that I have, as an official representative of the State of Israel, the media war is not the only war that we have to wage. I mean, this come only in second position in importance after the war itself. So the PR, of course, the PR war is very important. It's part of the campaign, but before that, we have to protect our own citizens. And to be able to do it the best way, we thought that it would be done without the presence of journalists in the area, as I explained.
But journalists were banned from going into Gaza, what, 6 weeks before? 2 months before? So were you planning already, 2 months before, the kind of invasion you would have, and you weren't allowed journalists in that 2-month period?
I can tell you that I myself and many of my colleagues and the Israelis, we were very surprised when my government decided to wage this, to start this operation in Gaza. So I cannot, it's not me who can give you an answer for if we thought, if we prepared 6 weeks before, if we knew about it. Maybe very few people in Israel knew about it.
Actually, can I just say something? Because I do think that I can't quite believe, Lior, that you were really surprised by the conflict in Gaza, because actually we were all expecting something for quite a long time, and I think we were all taken slightly by surprise on the exact timing, i.e. on the Saturday morning. But I think that we were all expecting something fairly big, and if the Western media was pretty much expecting that to happen, it's very hard to believe that those of you that are employed by the Israeli government weren't also expecting something.
Let me make a correction here, okay?
Yeah.
I was not surprised that when Israeli started this operation, with airstrikes. I was surprised when we continued it and we decided to enter with the ground forces, okay? Because it was unavoidable for it. Yes, it was understandable. It was not a surprise for the Israelis that after a continuous barrage of missiles during 3 years of thousands of missiles of Israel, that at some point after a long period of restraint, that my government was left with no other choice but to wage this campaign in Gaza.
I want to go back to Jerusalem, to you, Ruthie, and ask, now that you were, as a journalist, not just observing the conflict, but probably observing the way journalists elsewhere were covering it, how other countries covered it, do you think, on reflection, that Israel suffered from a poor press twice over, once for banning journalists, and secondly in the way that the conflict was covered? A long question. There you are.
I'll answer it if you let me pose a question to Jonathan afterwards. My answer really is that I think that in general, Israel is covered poorly. I don't want to get into the conflict. As you said in the beginning, this is not a discussion about our opinions of the conflict, though I think it is connected to media coverage. The reason I wanted to pose Jonathan a question has to do with the fact that he covered the war in Lebanon in 2006. And since this issue of the banned journalists is an issue of freedom of speech or lack thereof, I would like to ask Jonathan if he was limited once inside Lebanon by Hezbollah, was the Hezbollah dictating to you as a foreign journalist what you could or could not cover?
I think I got most of that.
Yeah.
No, they weren't, Ruthie. They.
Did you get?
Sorry, we didn't catch you there, Ruthie.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh, go for it, Jonathan.
Yes.
We'll hope
Okay,
to
look,
respond.
Did you hear my question?
I did get the question,
Yeah.
yes. Let me try to answer. Hezbollah did not restrict access. We went into the southern suburb of Beirut, Dahir, which was very heavily bombed early on in the war. And we were able to speak to Hezbollah people there. They quite quickly disappeared, went underground, and certainly those who were waging war in the south by firing rockets into Israel were not accessible to journalists. To the best of my knowledge, very few journalists at all got access to Hezbollah, and certainly none to Nasrallah himself. Now, in the case of Gaza, I was actually in Gaza just after Gilad Shalit was captured there. Hamas was out and about and openly talkable to, but of course they weren't running the place just then. It was still under Fatah. This time, I was able to access Hamas when I did finally get into the Gaza Strip. We made a film about it. My producer, Girish Janeja, who's here tonight, and I went and met a Hamas spokesman, spoke to him openly. We were at one stage followed. We raised this with the minister, he was a minister, and he said, right, we'll sort this out straight away, and there was no more trouble. We were able to reflect, just to finish off, we were able to reflect in the piece that we did about Hamas, the fact that they too intimidated a lot of people in residential neighborhoods from which they were definitely firing rockets. We documented a case in Bet Lahia in which a whole neighborhood was flattened, primarily because Hamas was using one house to fire rockets from. The locals had gone up to the people who were doing this and said, please stop doing it. This is a residential neighborhood. Those who complained vociferously were warned not to complain. One man's son was shot on the leg, apparently, and the net result of all of this is Hamas carried on firing, and the entire neighborhood was flattened by Israeli bombs. Bottom line is, we were able to talk to people about Hamas. We were able to cover the fact that Hamas, there is no black and white in this conflict. They intimidated the local population too. When we were unable to get into the Gaza Strip, we were unable to report that aspect of the conflict.
Can I ask you, Leo, do you think that, and Ruthie kind of suggested this right at the beginning of what she said, is it the feeling within Israel that Israel doesn't get a fair crack of the whip from the foreign press, and that was one of the reasons behind the idea of denying access?
I think that this is the feeling among the Israelis, that the foreign media doesn't always reflect properly the two sides of the conflict. But I don't think that this affected our decision. Let me give you an example of why I guess that Israelis feel that this imbalance. For example, when Sderot and the population in southern Israel, after being subjected during months to those missiles attacks, we tried to, of course, to flow this issue and to be invited. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all the official spokespeople in Israel, they invited the journalists based in Israel to go to Sderot and to cover it and to film it and to show the feelings. And we told them, look, please, you have to prepare to show it in order to prepare the public for the world to know about it, because at one point we will have to react, and when we react it will be very harsh, and then people will start to ask, but why we are doing it, and they will not understand the background, they will not have the full context, they will not have the big picture. And those journalists they covered Sderot, the issue of Sderot, the plight of the people in Sderot, very little, not enough.
Harriet, I mean that.
Well,
That's a
interesting.
charge
No, no,
against British
It's
journalism.
interesting because actually, you know, I'm trying to remember how many occasions over the past, you know, 4 years or so that we've reported from Sderot, and I would think that there are, you know, there are either lots that I can remember, and you know, I think obviously it is a very important issue to try and understand, you know, what it's like for Israelis to live under, you know, constant rocket bombardment. But you know, nevertheless, I would say that in the context of this particular conflict, you know, there were 9. I think 9. Is it 9 or 10 Israeli civilians killed?
3 civilians.
3 civilians.
Yeah.
All right, the
10
rest are
soldiers, 3
soldiers.
civilians.
Okay. You know, compared to you know, 1,300 Palestinians, and I think that you know that is a kind of a massive imbalance.
So I understand your professional consideration to underreport the plight of Sderot. I understand you. It's less filmable, it's less picturable. You see less blood, less casualties, and I understand you.
I think you'll find that Al Jazeera spent, I'm fairly certain it was at least 2 days, if not longer, in Sderot, reporting from southern Israel, saying, look, this is what happens here, and we did that. And we did that within the last 2 years. And we've been in Sderot, and I know we did it because when I was covering in Israel, I said, we should really go down and do a piece in Sderot. I said, we're doing it in 2 weeks' time. We're going to spend time down there.
You did it. You did it from time to time. I'm not saying that you've never done it. You did it. Even Al Jazeera in English.
But I'm sure you understand the news values where, correct, I've probably got the figures wrong, but roughly I think in the last 10 years, 5 people have been killed by rocket attacks. 5 people have been killed by rocket attacks. So you can understand why.
This is the conceptual mistake here. The fact that only very few Israeli citizens were killed from those primitive homemade missiles, for you, from your professional point of view, it doesn't merit a bigger coverage than you did, than you dedicated to it. But from our point of view, and from the people living in southern part of Israel, it's not enough, because it's only by luck that only 5 or 10 people in Israel were killed. We understand. Hypothetically, we can say that, well, if one of those missiles had hit kindergarten in Sderot, killing 20 kids in Sderot, then you would have dedicated more coverage to it.
Well,
But we didn't want to wait until that happened.
You have me.
We had to go there into Gaza and wreak havoc there, yes, in order to prevent, to try to reduce to the minimum their ability to launch those primitive missiles on us.
You have me at a disadvantage here. Does the Israeli media cover these attacks every single day in detail?
Yes.
Oh, let me go to Ruthie. Ruthie, would you say that the Israeli media, the Israeli newspapers, have adequately covered over a period of time the rocket attacks on Sderot and in southern Israel?
Well, I'll admit that it goes in spurts. Whenever there's a hot spot activity in Israel, all of a sudden, all of the journalists, they'll run to that spot and a little bit, things back to business as usual. So it's not there's state coverage, although recently there has been, because there was steady activity, there were steady missile attacks. But I wouldn't say that Sderot has been front page news in the last 8 years. Absolutely not. In fact, the residents of Sderot, very much like the residents of Akko that had some unrest recently, complain that they feel that mainstream Israel considers them to be somehow on the periphery because they tend to be socioeconomically on a lower level. And they feel that they get a very bad rap by the Israeli media, in fact.
Now, that's interesting, isn't it?
It's interesting. I know you asked me whether the Israeli media covered the issue of the road more than the foreign media did.
Yes.
Yes. And the fact that the Israelis knew in details about the tragedies, about the post-traumatic disease suffered by many kids in the road, is due to the fact that it was covered extensively in the Israeli media. In many days, it was the front page story. In many days.
I mean, I would put to you that, you know, wasn't it then convenient, a convenient byproduct of keeping foreign journalists out of Gaza Strip, that you therefore got Sderot, Beersheba, Ashkelon, Ashdod, all these places that were hit by these missiles covered?
Maybe it was a byproduct, because I understand you journalists, you had to stay there on the border with Gaza, and you looked for stories, and maybe the result was that you went more than you did before to Sderot. But I don't understand the question.
Most of the commentary. Let's come to the commentary, and I'm going to throw it open to the audience in a second. Most of the commentary in the British press, after a day or so, and certainly by 5 or 6 days or so, was that this had been a disproportionate response. Beautifully, poetically, tragically put in a headline in the Daily Mirror of all places, in an article by an Israeli who disagreed with it, who said that this was an eye for an eyelash. Do you not feel that, in a way, that the foreign media, particularly the British media, responded in such a way that it was worse for the Israelis than if you'd allowed people to go in?
It's very hard to tell. It's a very hypothetical question. I can refer to the coverage as it was, given the fact that the journalists were not in Gaza. But I don't know what was the connection between them being in Gaza or not. About the disproportionality, yes, in some articles, of course, there were this claim of Israel acting disproportionately against the threat from Gaza was raised again and again. In some articles, it was very funny, because in the same article, I think it was in The Independent, they wrote that Hamas is a terrorist organization, full stop. Okay? They were very clear about the unappeasable nature of Hamas. And then the headline was different, or in another place in the article they wrote, yes, but Israeli acted disproportionately. I can understand why the media here and the public here got the feeling that Israel was acting disproportionately. Yet, I'm glad that I'm here. Let me try to explain why we don't think that it was that disproportionate.
Just see,
Can I?
I'm just
It's
imagining.
a short story.
Yes, all right. You can do the story, but I'm just like imagining this: that if there'd been journalists in there, and they had witnessed Hamas using people almost as human shields, as firing from UN headquarters, as using schools to launch rockets, that would have been a massive plus for your position. And yet they couldn't do that because they weren't allowed in. That's what I'm.
It's a good
that's what
point.
I'm seeing.
It's a good point, and in fact, after the ceasefire, where some foreign journalists were allowed in Gaza, some of them, in Corriere della Sera, the Italian Corriere della Sera, and other newspapers in Austria and other places, they were able to interview people in Gaza, and they brought a lot of evidence that some residents of Gaza were how they were kept as human shields by Hamas, how Hamas people imposed themselves on their houses, how they launched missiles from within their houses, how they threatened and maimed them if they refused to cooperate. So subsequently, we find out that, yes, some of the journalists who were there in Gaza after the ceasefire reported the truth or the reality from Gaza. But this is the issue here. This is the dilemma, one of the dilemmas that we have to face. We have to choose between a bad decision and a worse, a bad option and a worse decision. So we deemed it as the better position of the two, a better option of the two, to not to let journalists in Gaza, for the reasons that I mentioned before. about the story about the disproportionality.
Yes.
Imagine a farmer, okay? I'm sorry if I'm being propagandist when I'm telling this story, okay? Imagine a farmer living with his family in his little house in the middle of the prairie. And he has a shotgun. And one night, he hears some noises and he sees 4 thieves coming with knives, only with knives and swords. And it's obvious that they're coming with aggressive intentions. And it's obvious that they're going to rob him and maybe kill him and his family. But he wakes up at that night and he takes his shotgun and he kills them 4. So there are 2 questions here. Is it disproportionate for him to use a shotgun while they are using only knives and swords? And is it disproportionate for him because he killed 4 and they killed none?
Interesting metaphor. I think this would be an appropriate moment to ask if there are any questions. Am I crazy? I want to do. Can I?
It's hard to try and hear Ruthie. She's trying to come in several times, and it's a shame because I'm sure she's got things to say. Sorry to.
Okay. All right. Well, I will come back to Ruthie. I promise you, and I'm sure she does have a lot to say. Yes, she does. I'm going to ask, when I take questions, firstly, there's a microphone coming round. If you'd wait for the mic to arrive, which I hope works better than my mic. And secondly, if you would say who you are. You may, of course, wish to remain anonymous, and you can say, I wish to remain anonymous, but otherwise, if you're quite happy to say who you are, that would be good too. The gentleman over here first. That's you, and the microphone is coming.
Thank you. My name is Chris Wangler. I was for many years, when I was young, a sound recordist. Later on, I became a producer of documentary films. When I was a sound recordist, I covered 7 wars. I know it's not very many compared to some of you chaps, beginning with the Malaysian confrontation, Vietnam, Yom Kippur War. I went in with soldiers during the Frelimo uprising against the Portuguese, MPLA, PIGC.
We get the
yeah, okay. They say that the security of their journalists and film crew are paramount. Well, in all the situations I was in, I never saw any example of any corporation that was paying me the funds to be there to provide any security. In those days, we didn't even have flak jackets. Could you explain how you protect your frontline journalists?
Well, you know, I would put this to Leo, but the truth is he's kind of answered that, hasn't he? He's saying not simply that it was a matter of protecting them, but he was protecting also the Israeli Defense Forces because they would wish to respond quickly to Hamas, but were unable to if they felt they were going to fire on the journalists. Of course, Alan has pointed out that they've shot journalists in the past, the Defense Forces, in mistakes. They've claimed. But I think we'll take that question. Perhaps you can think about that in a second. This person here.
Hello, my name's Joy Elodie. I'm a freelance journalist. I wanted to ask about, in the first few days in the week of conflict, there were a lot of images coming out of Ashkelon and Sderot, because news channels had to fill up the airwaves with something. Do Al Jazeera, or representatives of Al Jazeera, Channel 4 and The Guardian perhaps regret in retrospect having given so much time, and perhaps even do they feel manipulated by the Israeli media?
Regret? Well, let's start with you, Jonathan. I mean, so now the argument is, in a sense, that it was disproportionate coverage of Sderot and Ashkelon and so on, because that's the only pictures you could provide.
Well, it's not my job to regret. I would say we're also Channel 4 News, not a 24-hour news channel like Alan's is, where there is the pressure to fill our time. We are a 1-hour program. I think the net result of having our journalists on the Israel side of the fence meant that there was quite a lot of coverage of stuff going on inside Israel, when in actual fact most of the killing was going on the other side. When we, it was being reported, and being reported very well, I thought. There was tremendous stuff coming out from Palestinian journalists, but as I already said there, I mean, it maybe wasn't. It's hard to know how different it would have been had more Western correspondents been inside. It's very hard to judge that.
Well, let's go to 24-hour news. I mean, do you feel you overdid almost?
No, I've no regrets about the coverage that we filmed from Israel in Sderot and Ashkelon. The advantage, of course, that we had, Al Jazeera had, is that we were in Gaza. We had identified that as an important area in the Middle East, that it was going to be a hub of a story. And whereas the BBC made the decision to close their bureau there, CNN had never had one, it's sending people in. We took the decision at launch that Gaza would be an important part of our network, and we've had an office there since day one. So we were in prime position. We could cover the story of what was going on. We didn't have to rely on our, like the BBC did, our local producers whose English wasn't brilliant and had never really broadcast. We had Eamon Mohadin and Shireen Tadros, who are first-class broadcast journalists. So the stuff that we covered from Israel, and I did it myself in Sderot, and when we went to Beersheba, where they'd never hit before, that suddenly became much further than any rockets had ever reached. We were in Beersheba, we interviewed Zippy Livni there. I think we did that because it helped put in context exactly what was going on the Israeli side, and I think Al Jazeera's mission is to show both sides of the story, and I think we probably did better than most in doing that.
I want to just ask Ruthie then. Ruthie, did you see any of Al Jazeera's coverage from inside Gaza? A simple yes or no before I go on to the next question.
Yes.
And excellent. And what did you think of that? Did you think it was biased?
She said it
from Gaza in Arabic. So I only got Al Jazeera in Arabic, so I couldn't understand it. But the pictures we saw coming from Gaza were pictures of great devastation, both on Al Jazeera and Ramadan television.
And what effect do you think that had on you as a journalist and on the wider Israeli population?
You know, I think the wider Israeli population was in such a state of consensus about this operation that it had no effect other than some sort of relief that maybe finally we're going to get some peace.
Okay.
Sorry, Roy, but Ruthie, isn't it true that very few Israeli TV stations carried pictures of what was going on in Gaza? So night after night, the people in Israel didn't really see what was being done in their name.
That's not quite true. We did see quite a few pictures. In fact, on Israel television, we had footage from Ramadan. We did see footage, and we did know that there was great devastation going on there. We also saw photographs, still photographs. It is not that we didn't see the horrific pictures. It is that we felt terrible for the Palestinians living in Gaza who were being used as human shields. That's why we sent leaflets and brochures and made phone calls and warned them to get out of their homes. And, you know, we knew that that devastation was going on. And we were upset about it. Only the culprit we thought was Hamas.
All right, back to the audience. Just in the centre here. And just so I can, and you next, so that you, yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm James McIntyre, New Statesman. Can I just three very, very quick specific points for the spokesman, who I do think deserves respect for coming here tonight. Why, if your interest is in protecting Western journalist security, and why, if Sderot is so dangerous, did you just tell us that you invited journalists there? Secondly, do you agree with the Israeli press, the populist press out there, that the BBC is anti-Israel, when the BBC has just proved itself, if anything, to be pro-Israel by bizarrely refusing to broadcast the humanitarian appeal? And thirdly, why, if you're interested again in the security of journalists, did you invite Fox News, the Murdoch-owned pro-Israel vessel, to Gaza? And is it, in fact, the case, as Danny Seaman, Israel's head of press, said in an interview with the New York Times, that you were worried journalists would be stooges of Hamas? Oh, and very finally, sorry, on the on your prairie
Counting the questions.
Sorry, last one. On the prairie anecdote, surely the difference is that those who were shot were all robbers, whereas the majority of people probably in Gaza weren't guilty. Thanks.
Okay, well, right. Okay, there's a lot of interesting questions there, if we can remember them all. Let's first of all take the Fox News. Why do you think, you may not know the answer to that?
I don't.
I didn't realise that Fox News was pro-Israeli.
No. I also had the feeling that they are pro-Israeli, but the question was about why they were allowed.
They were given special access?
No, they were invited in, yeah.
I didn't remember.
The Supreme Court allowed 8 journalists to go in. The Foreign Press Association of Israel got to pick 6. The Israeli government insisted on nominating the other 2, and they picked Fox News, who are widely perceived in Israel to be pro-Israel, and they picked NBC, Martin Fletcher, who has been there for many, many years, is a first-class journalist and is Jewish.
According to to what I know about the decision before the ceasefire to let number, I think 8 journalists to go into Gaza, I know that the decision has been passed to FPA, Foreign Press Association in Israel, and of course the Israeli government lets FPA members decide who are going to be those 6 to 8 journalists. And I think that you haven't reached any decision because there was a lot of competence.
They picked 6. They picked 6, and the Israeli government insisted on 2 others, who were Fox and NBC.
I guess that it was a decision made by the GPO, the Government Press Office, headed by Danny Simon.
We'll leave the eating into your metaphor story for a second, which is an interesting rhetorical point. But what was the first point you made? Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah, while we were not...
yeah, you weren't worried about journalist safety in Sderot. Yeah, that's... Yeah.
Well, because obviously it's less dangerous to go in Sderot in a daily... yes? Yes. Admission that what? I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that our reaction was not harsher than the attack on us. I'm not saying that. I'm not denying that.
Okay, in the center here.
Hi, my name is Joe, and I'm currently at the LSE, and I just finished 2 years of reporting on the politics of Beijing from the Beijing Bureau of ABC News. And I was just curious about learning more from both sides here. Was there any pressure? What kind of pressure was there from journalists, from news organizations to allow them in after this decision was made? And why wasn't there more pressure coming from Western organizations to go in? And if there was, why didn't we hear more about it in the news? Was it a news cycle issue? Just a little more backstory.
Okay, well, I'm going to put that to Harriet, because I've heard that charge from my own students at City, which is, you know, they are saying, God, didn't the Western media didn't push hard enough, surely?
We pushed
Question, by the way, it's not a charge.
No.
I know, but I'm turning it into a charge. That's my job. Okay.
We pushed hard. We were for the first 3 days of the conflict. You know, we had a reporter at Erez, arguing with the officials to be allowed in, to absolutely no avail. Other news organisations were there too. The Foreign Press Association brought a court case in Israel to try and force the Israeli government to allow foreign journalists in. We in The Guardian reported that. It was reported elsewhere. Of course we tried hard. But actually, that wasn't the main story. You know, I mean, although I think it was important that we were making lots of efforts behind the scenes, and we did, report it. The main focus of our reporting was trying to cover what was going on in Gaza. You know, and I mean, it would have been wrong to turn it into just a story about journalists.
I'm going to ask you this. It's a tough question, I know. But there I was sitting watching night after night on the TV, people in flak jackets on the border, and I kept saying to myself, this is a really naive question, but it has a point to it. Why aren't the buggers just running across? Why are journalists not simply ignoring the Israeli authorities and going anyway?
Because there's a real danger, as we found out when we went down to Kisifib on the day before the land war started. We were in what was called a restricted military zone. We passed 2 police patrols to get there. They waved at us. as we drove past. We were filming out the car, and we were arrested by the army and held for 5 hours, handed over to the police, and held for a further 3. So you could try and run across, but at some point you were going to meet Israeli military there, because they were there in their absolute thousands, and it was very difficult. Can I also say that on the hill, I think on the day the land war started, we had a few bangs close to us, and I put on my flak jacket. That was the only time I wore it, and someone in London said to me, these people that are wearing their flak jackets, what great publicity for the Israelis, because it looks really dangerous where they are. I never thought of it in those terms, but I didn't wear it because I didn't feel at risk. But these people who were standing there wanting to be war reporters with their crash helmets and their jackets on,
I wouldn't
playing
never
into the
say that
Israeli
about
army.
Jeremy Byrne, but Jeremy Byrne's flak jacket got a lot of airing, I think.
I have 2 points. The first one is James Miller. He was actually trying to leave at the time, but he was killed on the border down in Rafah. And the other point is that you Leo, cited the case of Lorenzo from Corriere della Sera. Absolutely amazing man. Took huge risks, and one of the risks that he took was to come in while the conflict was raging with a handful of others, like Ben Wiedemann from CNN and Inigo Gilmore for us. And Lorenzo came under very sustained Israeli fire for 2 hours. He was pinned down. He told us this story. It was a remarkable escape. And that was as a result of his trying to report the story accurately. And then you cite him as someone who did indeed present a very fair description of what happened inside Israel. So good on him.
I was not there, but we can assume that the force that did not know that Lorenzo from Corriere del Sera was there. Okay, this is to show you the complexity of situation in such a war zone. And you spoke about Jeremy Byrne, so it reminds me of a story with which I dealt personally related to the BBC. During the war, some senior editor in the BBC phoned me and sent me an email telling me, Lior, please speak with Israel, with Jerusalem, with whoever you have to, because your forces are shooting at a building where Rushdie Abu Aluf, you know, all Rushdie Abu Aluf now, he became very famous now, and we know that from the first floor of that building, Hamas forces are shooting at you. Also to show you the complexity. And of course, I immediately phoned Jerusalem. They immediately with my people in the foreign ministry, and they immediately phoned the IDF.
Okay. Yeah, that's you. I'm going to take a cluster next time.
Okay.
Go for
okay.
it.
Just to tell you that being born before the Second World War, I was I was a friend of Israel, and when I was young, I wanted to go and work in a kibbutz, just to say. Well, my views changed after Sabra and Shatila dramatically, yeah? You may remember. My 2 questions are very simple. Is it true that Israel sent, the plane sent a bomb with phosphorus on Gaza? Is that something normal sort of thing in wars at the moment? And my second question is, I heard that several soldiers in Israel refused to go into Gaza, and because they were appalled by what was happening. So
can I just say, there are 2 interesting questions, but they're not. They go further, wider remit than I was willing to go to. But I don't know whether you want. The phosphorus bombs is a fantastically important issue, of course, if true. Can you answer that?
I have 2 short answers. Yes, we know about the second question. Yes, there were some soldiers who refused to go there into Gaza from ideological reasons, and we respect it. Then they had to face the consequences of because of the law in Israel. But also it shows
that doesn't seem like they're respecting it. But
no,
anyway.
but it's not that they were executed, let's say, as happens in other authoritarian countries. And about the first question, the phosphorus which we used in that war is not. whatever weaponry that we used in that war, including the white phosphorus, is used by other forces in the world and it's in accordance with the international law.
All right, John, just come back to John.
Okay, I just want a quick riposte on the white phosphorus.
That'll get us waylaid. Go on, quickly.
I will be quick. I don't think you can state categorically that it was used in accordance with international law, because if it's used legally in war, it's used as either a smokescreen or to illuminate a battlefield at night. We documented, and if anybody wants to see the evidence, filmed in an UNRWA school in northern Gaza City, children burned by white phosphorus. I personally was hitting with a rock lumps of white phosphorus which smoked and then burst into flames. I don't think there's much doubt for those who investigated and witnessed it that it was used and that civilians were hit by it.
Well,
Whether they were targeted as
we will hear more about this when the UN investigate. I'm certain, but I think that did immediately go further than we're going to go. I'm going to take this gentleman, this lady, and that gentleman there as 3 questions, and then and we'll respond afterwards. So I'll try and keep a note of what you said. Yeah.
So 2 questions to the journalists who appear to me on 2 fronts to be perhaps a little disingenuous. Firstly, when you claim that you are taking responsibility for your journalists as you send them in, are you also therefore declaring that when once an Israeli bomb kills one of your journalists and there is a media outcry of what the state of Israel is doing, that the next headline you will publish is, "This is our fault, we took responsibility," or will you join the clamour for stopping the action? Secondly, in terms of the disproportionate response, what I'm hearing generally from the journalists here is the flavour of what we got in the British press and continue to get, which is that bombs are coming over to Israel, but they're mostly hitting sand, not really hurting anyone. It's unfortunate that occasionally people die. In Gaza, it's an absolute disaster, and it is an absolute disaster, absolutely. But I'm wondering whether your coverage and the use of disproportionate would be slightly different if the bombs were flying from southern London into London and weren't hitting very many people, but this went on for months and months and years from a group of people who said, "We want you all to be dead." If London police then marched across the border and killed a lot of people, would you declare that to be an eyelash for an eye?
Right. Well, I'll not have any trouble remembering that one. Let's jump on over there. Yep, and then it'll be you after. Yeah.
Roxana Hamid, photojournalist. Referring back to something that Alan Fisher said earlier about Shireen Tadros and Ayman Mohieldin, 2 fantastic journalists working in Gaza all through the conflict. Also, the BBC journalist who was trained up by Alan Johnston. My question, and I stress it as a question, not a charge, is there still a belief amongst the Western media that a story can only truly be objectively reported if it's reported by a Western journalist and not a local?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Yeah. The answer is yes.
Yeah, my question.
That's a joke. Right. Okay. Yeah.
My question is to the media. I'm curious to know why do you think among at least 20 conflicts around the world, violent conflict around the world, that people are dying every day, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not proportional, the coverage this conflict take, if you compare it to other conflicts that are going on, and the bloodshed, the numbers are much bigger. This is the first question. The second is about civilians being killed. Did you ever reported from a war zone that civilians didn't inevitably killed, died, hurt? I particularly want to know if you can compare the situation to Chechnya, to Georgia, and give us a real, I want to know your objective view as a media.
Right, well, that's interesting because we now have 3 questions aimed at the journalists and gives Leora time to take a bit of breath. Harry, I'll start with you about disingenuous journalists and taking up the business about the disproportionate response, and would we cover that? That's a bit more hypothetical, but the disingenuous journalists first.
Do you mean on the security issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, I think we do take absolutely responsibility for our journalists in any kind of conflict zone, and we, prepare people properly, we equip people properly, we train people properly, we have, proper procedures for, keeping contact, for safety, for people getting out when they're in situations that we or they think are, a risk too far. I mean, if we had sent one of our journalists in who then had been killed in a shelling, then obviously, you have to kind of look at the circumstances of it, and you putting a face at me, but I mean, of course you have to look at the circumstances of it. That's why you have to look at the circumstances of everything that you're reporting, which is why you want to be there. If our reporter was being reckless, then I don't think we would cry foul, because I think that if your people are indulging in kind of reckless behaviour or activity, then that is your responsibility. But there are you can't answer that question in the abstract.
Alan, let me go to you about that question from the front there about is something only true when the Western media report it? In other words, we don't trust any other media except our own.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's been something that Al Jazeera has tried to fight against. If you look around most of our bureaus around the world, you'll find people who actually come from that country. English might be their second language, but they speak it to an incredibly high standard, better than many of my countrymen, it must be said. And the reality is that, they're not British, they're not American, they're not Australian. Therefore, can we really believe what they're saying, because they look a bit different from us? And I think that people question their objectivity, or whether or not there was balance in the reports from Gaza. But from Gaza, it wasn't a case of balance. It was a case of truth. And that's what they were trying to get to, the truth of what was going on and what they were seeing in front of their very own eyes. And I think Eamon and Shireen did a magnificent job. And I think it's interesting that many Western organisations such as CBC in Canada, NBC in America, started to pick up and use Eamon and Shireen on their bulletins, because they realised that these guys could be trusted. But I think you're right. I think there's a bias against anyone who looks a bit different from us, or who works for a company whose name's a bit funny, and therefore, they're not the BBC, they're not CNN, and maybe can't be trusted.
Can I just add something on that?
Exactly, yeah.
One of the good things that came out of this in terms of the ban on the kind of Western journalists going into Gaza, was the kind of incredible and heroic reporting by lots of Palestinian translators and fixers, who the guy that the Guardian uses, was worked every day through the conflict, kind of inhuman hours, was in danger himself a lot, saw many members of his extended family being killed, was very, very difficult circumstances, but, did a kind of fantastic job. And I think that, that was a kind of great byproduct in the sense that we think, well, we've got a fantastic asset there that, a guy we've used for a long time, but I mean, certainly someone who really did a sterling job for us.
Can I turn the question around the other way, by the way, before I pick up that gentleman's questions, which is, you might ask yourself, just only making this point, that it's not only a case of whether the Western media believe it if they report it, but about whether their audiences believe it more if they report it. In other words, is it, you're preaching to an audience in Britain, are they going to believe what a Briton is saying more than they're going to believe somebody who's not? I think that's always an important question to keep in mind. Let me come to you, Jonathan, about the idea that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even using those terms immediately places me in a certain position, doesn't it? But that gets more coverage than perhaps many other conflicts. I'm not taking sides on this. Do you think that's the case?
I'm not convinced that it does, actually. Well, look, I mean, I've had to fight to go to cover these conflicts myself, because, why go there and not to somewhere else? As this one has been raging, so has the conflict in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are on their last legs. It's a very similar situation. A 250,000 civilians stuck inside an enclave, being fired on by both sides. The Sri Lankan government isn't allowing journalists in. It's almost identical. And it's not getting the coverage that it warrants. We ran on Channel 4 News the lead story on last Friday about it. We've covered it once since then, but I would agree with you there. In terms of the how much coverage Gaza and the conflict in Lebanon got, well, you know, there is huge interest in that. I mean, it's you know, as the Americans call it, the Near East. Look, when I went into Gaza, I saw things which were equivalent in terms of the level of destruction to Grozny, on a smaller scale perhaps, but it was not dissimilar in terms of the net effect. I feel that it did warrant the coverage that it got.
Can I ask Ruthie about this? Seen from your perspective, Ruthie, do you think that the conflict in your country gets more coverage than it should, or not enough? From foreign media, I mean.
I don't know. I don't think it gets more than it should. I think that often it gets disproportionate coverage compared to other conflicts at given times. But what I would like to say about whether Western journalists are more trustworthy or not, that I did want to say something about.
Yeah.
The issue is not whether the audiences believe Western journalists more or not. The issue about Western journalists, as opposed to journalists in countries that are dictatorships, is that Western journalists can attack their own governments with impunity. That's the point about Western journalists, not that they're objective necessarily more than other journalists. They may not be objective at all, but an American journalist can attack, and did, President Bush as much as he wanted, and a British journalist can do the same. And Israeli journalists go all out against their own government. The issue is what media outlet in another kind of regime is allowed to attack his own government, his own clerics. That is what makes a distinction between a Western journalist and a non-Western journalist.
Harriet, do you agree?
I think it's I couldn't hear everything that Ruthie was saying. The line's very bad. I mean, I think that you know, obviously it is easier for Western journalists to attack their own governments and to you know, attack other people's governments. You know,
does that in some way, you feel then, the corollary of that is, okay, we can, but does it mean that reporting from people who can't do that is bad?
No, not necessarily at all.
Okay, that's fine. You were going to make a point.
Yeah, just on the point of why Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine gets so much coverage, the reality is that conflict for the last 60 years has cast a shadow over everything that has gone on in the world and still does today. And significant events, such as what's going on in Afghanistan, what's happening in Iraq, are all linked in to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And therefore, over the last 60 years, things that you've seen, including terrorism in the Middle East, around Europe, around the rest of the world, is tied in to what happened on that little bit of soil 60 years ago. So therefore, it's a significant event, and developments have to be covered because it does have such a reach around the rest of the globe.
I think there's another...
Well, one second, yeah, Leo.
I think there's another practical reason for why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being covered in comparison more than other conflicts in the world. For practical reason is that Israel is a paradise for foreign journalists. Journalists.
Robert Fisk never told you that.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
It's so good you'll never leave.
Journalists.
I'll be allowed to.
When they go to Israel, they are considered to be war correspondents. They just spend a couple of hours near the war zone or in the war zone in the morning, and then in the afternoon at 4 o'clock they go to drink a coffee in Tel Aviv. You don't get it in Afghanistan or in Sri Lanka.
I think you've been reading the briefing book too much, to be honest.
Next time, Leo, you must accompany us through Ben Gurion Airport or leaving when we're hauled over the ropes by security services.
I'm going to take some more questions.
It's not the flawless paradise.
The gentleman right at the back. And who else? You and one here. Okay, I'll take those three. I spotted you, madam. Yep. Okay.
Hi, my name is Haider Safi, freelance journalist. About the metaphor which you mentioned, I want just to mention, there is another metaphor. You can't kill the hostages if a kidnapper took them. It's not allowed. Second thing, about the Lebanon war, there was a journalist got killed. She was a photographer, and she got killed after the shelling of Israeli helicopter. Last thing, I worked on a program called Unseen Gaza, and I went to Al Jazeera, and about the report of the Hamas rockets on Israel, I saw every, like almost, report was done by Al Jazeera correspondent inside Israel. But when I thought, it's my idea and my opinion, that it was unbiased reporting when they were reporting the rockets on Israel. But when I saw another report in a Western media done by one of the, I think either Sky or NBC, and I noticed that the correspondent was exaggerating the issue. For example, when he was mentioning the number of rockets, he was going through 8 years in order to highlight, like to make everything as the top as possible. It might not, I might like notice that because I'm working as a journalist. For example, he was mentioning 800 rockets, and he was mentioning the number of casualties over 5 years or 8 years. So it was done. Do you think that it was exaggerated in order to cover that kind of, let's say, avoid criticism from the other, from the Jewish lobby or something like that? Thank you.
Okay, all right. Lady at the back then.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Fatih. Just anyway, listening to the journalist, and when you are covering the war, something come to my mind always, anyway, with this conflict in particular. It's really, I mean, something is absent somewhere, that you are really not reporting the deep issue behind what's happening there. And Gaza and West Bank are under occupation and suffering daily for the last, not 60 years, because it is in 67 war. I mean, if Israel would accept to go out from those occupied territories and just give them back to Palestinian and consider Palestinian as a human as you are and as valuable as you are. Because, I mean, you were telling, it's really hurt me in heart. You were saying those primitive homemade missiles. Well, I mean, are they all also primitive people for you? You know, so just, I mean, it's, or let us all use just primitive weapons then also in your way.
The important media question there is about whether or not we contextualize properly. We'll come back to that in 1 second. I'm going to take 2 more questions. You're coming. This gentleman here, and then you.
Thank you. My name is Khalid. I'm not a journalist, but I'm just taking a view as an someone who was reading about the conflict. The Israeli government. I'm looking at you because I've got a question. You made a comment very early on in today that your government didn't want to take responsibility for the lives of journalists during the conflict, that you wanted your soldiers to be able to act in the way that they wanted to during the conflict. But then something in the back of my mind caused me problems because so many Gazans died during this conflict as well. So does that mean that your soldiers didn't want to take responsibility for the lives of Gazans as well?
Okay, we'll come back for that in a second, Leo. I'm going to take this person here as well.
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm also at the LSE. My question is more for the journalists on the panel, and not to compare the conflict in Gaza to what had happened with the media sort of communication clampdown in Burma, but I'm wondering what measures were taken, or sort of what outreach was done for citizen journalists in Gaza or in Israel or in Palestine. When I was in the States during the whole Burma situation, there was all these news outlets saying, sort of issuing public calls, whether via internet, radio, TV, saying, please, send whatever photographs you can through your cell phones, just send us whatever you can so we have some idea of what's going on. So for me, perhaps of my generation, it's somewhat difficult to hear sometimes that, that you're not getting the kind of access that you want when there are people there who have cell phones, who have cameras, who have internet connections, who can upload things and sort of speak to the outside community.
Okay, I'm going to go to the journalist first. I'll come to you, Harry. You'll probably kill me for coming to you first, but the question about whether or not there's enough contextualization.
It's a really difficult question, and it's something that worries me a great deal, and I think you're absolutely right to raise it. And I think that it's, to be honest, it's actually easier to provide context, I think, in a newspaper than it is if you're a broadcast journalist. When you have your time is much tighter, you have much less space to explain things. I mean, we strive in The Guardian and The Observer all the time to, provide background, context. I think what you have to do is you have to look at a coverage of a country or a region or a conflict over a long period of time. I mean, obviously there are days when news is very fast moving, when you're struggling just to kind of contain all the events that have happened over the course of the previous 24 hours. But I think context is very, very important. One of the things that's fantastic for us as practicing journalists today is that even though we have huge constraints in terms of newspaper space, we can provide lots of context in terms of our digital journalism. And if you look on the websites of any serious news organization, there's lots of background material there. Actually, if viewers, readers want to find out more about the context, it's very easy to go and find it from those news organizations because they all exist. But I think it's a really, really good point, and it's something that we don't do enough of, because you can never do enough of it, but it's something that we take very seriously.
See, Jonathan, there are people I've heard who think that occupied territories are being occupied by the Palestinians. Why don't the Israelis kick them out? This is the level of misunderstanding of of the Middle East conflict itself. Isn't it right, Harriet wasn't attacking you in any way by saying it, but isn't it right that the broadcast media fail utterly, really, to ever contextualize, explain the history of something? They're only there for the event itself.
I have to say, Channel 4 News is absolutely brilliant.
Well, that got you off the hook.
I'd take the point, because we are very constrained by time. I think our program is slightly different. We're not doing sort of on-the-spot news pieces all the time. We have the ability to contextualize a bit. It is really crucial in a conflict like this to remain as impartial as humanly possible. Haider at the back made a comment earlier about this, and I think journalists were straining to remain impartial when faced with what was quite clearly the disproportionate force, which even you admit to, Leo. We too, as broadcast outlets, have websites in which background information is put. I myself wrote a long blog today about concerning this conflict. So there is stuff that isn't broadcast, which is there, and which can be read. I can't remember what the focus of the question was now.
No, I take it. Let me go. This will be the last time I can go to Ruthie, because we're about to break. But Ruthie, do you think that the conflict, as described in the Western media that you see, is adequately described in the sense that there's enough understanding of history and of the context of the dispute between Israelis and Palestinians?
Absolutely not. And in fact, in this very discussion, I heard again and again things which I totally disagreed with. Among them, the person who asked the question said that, and aside from the disproportionate force, which is totally ridiculous, the only reason there are disproportionate numbers is because the Hamas did not protect its citizens, but rather used them as cannon fodder, and the Israelis were building bomb shelters and protecting our citizens. That's number one. As for context, in fact, the woman who said that all the problems in the world, or someone else who said that all the problems in Afghanistan and everywhere else have to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is absolute nonsense. In fact, if you want to talk about the problems that are all linked together, it's global jihad, and Hamas is an Iranian proxy like Hezbollah, and that is the root of the problem right now. Israel and the Palestinians are a minuscule part of that, and you would see that if Israel disappeared tomorrow.
Okay, thank you, Ruthie, for staying with us.
Did you get that?
Through different, we got that. We got that. Let me ask about this question about citizen journalists. By the way, do we feel that there was an absence of citizen journalism in Gaza?
I mean, I think one of the heartening things over the past few years has been the kind of rise of citizen journalism, and the fact that actually we now have access to kind of lots more material than we ever did before. And in fact, we used it. I'm sure you guys used it too. It wasn't always easy because, I mean, although despite what the contributor said about, everybody's got an internet connection, actually in Gaza they don't always have an internet connection because the power isn't always on, or it certainly wasn't during this conflict. But I mean, I think citizen journalism is something that we all have to kind of take seriously.
So, and we were able to use, for example, mobile phone footage documenting the missile strike and phosphorus bombs over a school, which was absolutely compelling viewing, taken by a teacher in one of these schools. So it was used, but just to add to that, there wasn't the need to do it in Gaza in the way that there was in covering the monks' uprising in Burma or Nagas, because there are so many Palestinian journalists who are true professionals. Pictures were coming out, reports were coming out.
Can I take up one thing that our friend from the New Statesman asked that I know set alight my students, which is about the screening of the BBC, the Gaza appeal, or the non-screening of the BBC. This is not a representative audience, but on a show of hands, who thought the BBC was right not to show the Gaza appeal? And those who thought it was wrong then? Well, that would surprise me because that was the reverse of my students, which was a great surprise to me. Do you think the BBC should have screened it? I'll just put you on the spot there, Leon.
Well, some of
it's
the
last time, yeah.
Although no one can ignore the suffering and the devastation in Gaza and the need of the population in Gaza to receive help, assistance, aid from the international community and from donors in Britain. I understand the argument of the BBC not to broadcast it from their professional point of view, as they argumented it very well, and they don't need to do it because they, to put it in a nutshell, because they themselves differentiate between coverage of the situation in Gaza and the unchallenged, the free airtime for unedited material.
Okay, Jonathan, your view on the screening?
The United Nations, the ICRC, and the DEC obviously here declared what went on in Gaza as a humanitarian crisis. It's my belief, personal belief, that in not airing the appeal, the BBC made a value judgment about that. What I saw in Gaza was a humanitarian crisis. It is possible that among the 25,000 homes either totally or partially destroyed, that Hamas was shooting from all of them, but somehow I doubt that. I know that a lot of civilians were killed, despite Ruthie's and Leor's determination that efforts were made to prevent that where possible. What I saw in Gaza was a humanitarian disaster, and an awful lot of people have been left homeless.
Alan?
I think the BBC's decision was influenced by the fact that in recent years it's been accused of being pro-Arab rather than pro-Israeli, and it was determined in this conflict that it wouldn't be seen that way. And I think it was an extension of that. I think they decided that despite what the DEC was saying, what the Board of British Deputies was saying, what Ehud Olmert said, this wasn't an attack against the people of Gaza. I think the BBC took the decision that was a political decision, and while trying not to be partial, ended up being partial.
I'm going to take a last, yeah, we run over time, but I can take a last question because you've been really straining at the bit there.
My name is Paula Park. I work for Dow Jones. I'm just wondering.
Is that Rupert Murdoch now?
Oh, I wish I wouldn't have to say yes.
Sorry. cheap point.
I just wonder if there was an attempt. We seem to have 2 representatives of the Israeli government here. Was there an attempt to have a Palestinian journalist here and a Hamas representative here?
That's not very funny. I don't know, to be absolutely honest with you. I'm not responsible for drawing up the list, but so I can't answer the question. And that serves me right for making a joke about murder.
I hope we are, as journalists, are not seen as counterpoints to, you know, the Israeli government's perspective. I mean, I myself am not. I'm here as a journalist and an eyewitness.
I understand that, but you are in the sort of forcibly in the position of speaking for the Palestinians.
No.
But I think, you know, look, this was not really, I mean, Leo is really good to be here, but he's acting as a media spokesman in a sense, and this is about a media argument. I feel myself, as I say, I wasn't responsible for drawing up the list of speakers, but I feel that that would then have led to what we wanted to avoid, which is rehearsing 60 years of conflict, which is certainly something that's interesting, and that's another debate altogether. But I want to thank everyone who took part. I want to thank the panel, Ruthie for sticking it out there in Jerusalem against all the odds, and Skype is a wonderful thing when you're doing it one-to-one, but it's really difficult when it's a panel like this, and there's that difficulty of always hearing, but we did hear enough. Thank you, Ruthie. Thank you to Alan. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to Leo, and thank you to Harriet. Thank you.